Good morning, friends. In the last episode, I spoke about the process of economic diplomacy. So let me change the pace and talk now about an altogether different issue, namely, how are diplomats appointed? But before I get into that, I have an apology. So far, I've been speaking of diplomats and ambassadors in the male pronoun. Um, that's wrong. I should have talked of women diplomats. I should have practiced greater gender sensitivity. So, in this episode, let me try and remember to address diplomats as she, ambassadors in the female pronoun. Okay. In every country, the gender barrier has crumbled slowly but inexorably. The first women ambassadors were appointed in the 20s. Most diplomatic services opened up to women gradually, and the process of gender equalization has now reached a point in Scandinavia, in some other countries as well, where more than 50% of new entrants are women. In India, in 1960, the percentage of women in the foreign service was about 11%. Today it is around 32-33%. The selection is through a transparent, scrupulously honest selection process called the Union Public Services Commission. So the percentage of women is really a function of how many women actually apply to join the service. And that is a shifting number, as I said, in every country in the world. In one respect, I suppose India is ahead of others. We have had 4 women heads of the Indian Foreign Service, who that person carries the rank, she carries the rank of Foreign Secretary. Words are confusing because in Britain, Foreign Secretary refers to the minister. But be as it may, if we look around the world, there are very, very few diplomatic services in Europe, in the Americas, or in Africa or Asia, where a woman has been the permanent head of the foreign ministry. And that's a barrier that's not easy to bring down. Okay, so let me get to my first point. How are diplomats appointed? What is the selection process? The world over, there is now an examination. In some countries, only the graduates of certain disciplines like political science and international affairs are allowed to sit for the exam. In most other countries, anyone can take the exam, like in the United States or in the UK or for that matter in Germany. Now, Germany used to have a propensity to select a lot of lawyers. Today, the focus has shifted much more in favor of economists, people who have studied economics or international affairs. The exam process everywhere is fairly straight, and it culminates with an interview. In some countries, the interview lasts for 2 days. The candidates move into a kind of secluded residence, a villa, and they spend morning to night with the interviewing team, which is usually 6 or 8 strong. And it's a complex process. At the other end of the spectrum, like in India, but also in many other countries, the interview is simply a 25 or 30-minute process. I think that's unfair. I think the interview process should be more rigorous. It should bring in psychologists, people from different disciplines. It should involve a group discussion. It should involve the participant doing something special to show abilities. UK uses an interesting method. Every interviewee is given a thick pile of documents and said you have half an hour to go through the papers relating to a specific case. It may be an economic issue, a cultural issue, a consular issue, and it's impossible to go through all the papers in that time. The whole idea is, how do you work under pressure? Can you sift through information? Can you flick through papers, absorb information, and then come to a fairly solid conclusion, having got a broad sense of the issue? I think that's brilliant. The people who enter the diplomatic service all over the world now come from a wide spectrum of social classes. Take Thailand. In Thailand, traditionally, the diplomats were the sons and increasingly the daughters of aristocratic families. That's changing. Not completely gone, but changing. In the UK, they were all graduates of Oxford and Cambridge. That has completely changed. They now come mostly from redbrick universities. I remember meeting a young Indian Foreign Service entrant who said with charming humility, honesty, that until he went to college, he did not own a pair of shoes. He came from such a family of modest circumstance, living in a village, that he went to school barefoot or occasionally wearing open slippers. Now, everywhere you now see more institutions represented, educational institutions, social backgrounds, income levels represented in the diplomatic service. My second question is a diplomatic service a kind of exclusive hierarchy, an exclusive nest of elites? As I said, there was a time when aristocrats dominated, but that's changed. But in a funny sort of way, they are elites in the sense that behind every person who has found a position in a foreign service, there stand a dozen, 50, in some cases hundreds of potential candidates who were not selected. Now, this does not mean that they were in any way inferior to others, because the process of selection, particularly when very large numbers are involved, becomes a kind of lottery. Some are successful as a matter of chance. I would not really believe that a foreign service officer is necessarily superior to anyone. But that person has been tested and has been found to be rather competent, rather able, and agile in thinking. So that is a kind of, shall we say, an echelon in that country who have the responsibility for doing a little bit more than others. Why does this matter? Because the diplomatic service is a kind of apprenticeship for the first 5-7 years. And it's strange. In India, we all sit for a common exam for the top civil services, and a combined merit list is produced, and the candidate selects or has selected in advance which services she or he wishes to enter. Mostly, she will choose to join the Indian Administrative Service, which is the top home civil service. And then she may think of the police service, or she may think of the foreign service, or audits and accounts, or railways, one of 17, 19 services for which appointments are made through this process. In many other countries, the selection is exclusively for the foreign ministry. I think that's a good system. But then the Indian system also has its merits in that there is one simple egalitarian process for everyone to get into the top civil services. And then you decide which service suits you best. In small countries, the situation is radically different. There are countries where the size of the entire diplomatic service is barely 70 people or 120. Now, they can't, you would think, do an annual selection. Some of these countries appoint people into the service once in 3 or 5 years. I think that's unfair. It's unfair to candidates who are graduating from university, who want to join a civil service like the foreign service, but in that year and in the following year, no appointment is made. You know, I've had the privilege of speaking at something like 35 foreign ministries around the world. And in the smaller countries, I've tried to argue the case that even if you have a very small service, and you may on average take only 1 or 2 people a year, please do this as an annual process so that your graduating students, the youth, can plan their activities, can plan their life better, not wait for that once in 4 year opening of the door for new entrants. I can think of another model of selection which is quite different. I first found this in Armenia, a tiny country in Central Asia, and then I saw it again in the United Arab Emirates. In both these countries, what happens is that 25 or 50 young people are registered in an international affairs and diplomacy course. At the end of the course, around half of the best candidates are taken into the foreign service, into the foreign ministry. I think it's a brilliant idea because it really becomes a 1-year selection process to find the best. And what happens to the rest who don't get in? Not really a problem, because any number of banks, business enterprises, exporters, think tanks, research institutes want that category of person who has had intense exposure to international affairs over a 1-year period. I wish more countries thought of that particular process. My last point is about a question that comes up often. Are foreign ministries ivory towers? Are they places that practice exclusivity and reject outsiders? I'm afraid that image has persisted in many countries. It's not the reality, because as I've been saying all along in earlier episodes, today's foreign ministry has to connect with many, many stakeholders, many, many entities, including those that are outside the government circles. So how does a foreign ministry practice openness? There are several simple methods. One is take in people from other ministries, other disciplines on contracts. So let others come and see how you work and benefit from their domain expertise. Second, send your people to work in other ministries. Let them become emissaries, shall we say, of how a foreign ministry person thinks and works. Italy has a brilliant practice. Every major ministry has a diplomatic advisor appointed from the foreign ministry. And that person then becomes a permanent link between that ministry and the foreign ministry. Outstanding idea. There are countries like China that send scholars, academics to their embassies to work on building connections through the embassy in different countries with think tanks, scholars, academia. Again, a brilliant method, one that is relevant to so many countries that have fairly large diplomatic missions in major countries. Now, such a scholar, she would then become the link between the sending country's embassy and the academic, scholarly community of the receiving country. There is also then the large question of ambassador appointments. That's a big subject. I'll put it aside for another episode. So for now, thank you very much for listening to me. Keep well, safe, and I look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.